Hey there, Legal Tea listeners. This is your host, Jenny Roselle. Today we are on the estate planning of the rich and famous topic, and for today's episode, we're going to dive into what happened following the death of Leona Helmsley, which some, if not many, may not really immediately recognize her name. First, maybe I should not technically call her Leona, and here's why. So shortly after high school, she changed her name like many times. She was actually born Lena Rosenthal, but changed it over the course of time to Lee Roberts, then to Mindy Roberts, then to Lenny Roberts, and finally to Leona Roberts. And she later acquired Helmsley when she married a gentleman by the name of Harry Helmsley, which we'll get into in a minute. So on these estate planning of the rich and famous episodes, she may just mainly go under the rich category since she wasn't super famous. But yeah, so Leona, though, was most well known for being quite the businesswoman, and famously, she was called the Queen of Mean. As always with these type of episodes, let's dive into Leona first as a person, like her upbringing, her family, her career, etc. So that way we have a better understanding of her before we dive into what happened estate-wise following her passing. According to her Wikipedia page, Leona was born in the state of New York, and ultimately, after her family moved her a handful of times, they finally settled in Manhattan. At the age of 18, Leona married her first husband, Leo, who was an attorney, and they got married in 1938, though ended up divorcing in 1952. Together, though, they had one child named Jay. Jay was Leona's only child ever, but tragically, at the age of 42, Jay passed away of heart failure. Prior to his passing, Jay and his wife Mimi had 4 children. After Leona and Leo got divorced, that's why I stuttered. I was like, that doesn't sound right. After Leona and Leo got divorced, Leona proceeded to marry Joseph Lublin. Leona and Joseph got divorced, but they found their way back to one another because they actually ended up getting remarried after their divorce. But ultimately, their second marriage came to an end as well, and they got divorced a second time. And finally, in 1968, Leona met Harry Helmsley, who was actually married at the time and was a condominium broker. In 1970, Leona joined one of Harry's firms, and it was called Brown Harris Stevens, and she joined as a senior vice president. Well, Harry ultimately divorced his then wife and proceeded to start a relationship with Leona. And then in 1972, Harry and Leona got married. According to her Wikipedia page, quote, the marriage may well have saved her career, as several of her tenants had sued her the year before for forcing them to buy condominiums. They won, and she was forced to not only compensate the tenants, but to give them 3-year leases. Her real estate license was also suspended, so she focused on running Harry's growing hotel empire, end quote. And just to name drop a few things that Harry and now Leona owned, like 230 Park Avenue, which was the Helmsley building, the Empire State Building, the Tudor City apartment complex on the east side, and that's just naming a few. We're talking that the value of all of the things that they owned were in the billions of dollars, people. Billions with the B. Like, mega money here. Fast forward to 1983, when Harry and Leona purchased a mansion in Connecticut. And super long story short, they had a ton of work done on it, and after a dispute about payment with the contractors basically ratted out the Helmsleys by claiming that Harry and Leona had them invoice some of their hotels as, quote, business expenses, which, of course, they weren't business expenses to the hotels. They were for the mansion that they bought, the Connecticut mansion. That's kind of textbook tax fraud. So, yeah, that led to some serious things like fraud, conspiracy, tax evasion, and they were convicted of them. And she and they got in a lot of trouble, for sure. Throughout the court cases, Harry was actually showing very obvious signs of physical and mental decline, and in fact, he ended up getting declared unfit to stand trial. So they actually had two very separate trials or cases. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but Leona faced the charges alone. When all was said and done, Leona ended up spending about 21 months in prison. Just a few years later, Harry ended up dying in 1997. And after he passed away, Leona inherited Harry's entire fortune, which was estimated to be in excess of $5 billion, according to the Wikipedia page. A few of Leona's closest friends shared that after the court cases and Harry's death, Leona really isolated herself and went into seclusion. She became estranged from her grandchildren and just lived in her penthouse with her dog. While she was certainly known for being the Queen of Mean, like I referenced earlier, and she did some really icky things tax-wise, and there was actually even a case where the plaintiff, which was a former employee, alleged that the only reason he was fired was because he was gay. Well, he won, and she had to pay him lots of money. Rightfully so. But even though she was surrounded by some of these icky stories, she was also quite charitable with her money. According to her Wikipedia, she donated $5 million after the 9/11 attacks to families of New York City firefighters and police. Or she donated $25 million to a New York hospital for medical research. On August 20th, 2007, Leona ended up dying from congestive heart failure. She was 87 years old when she passed away. And after she passed away, a rather extensive estate plan was located, which included some very specific and very unique provisions and terms. Like, for example, according to her Wikipedia page, Leona did not like dirt. Yeah, like DIRT. And she actually left $3 million for the mausoleum in which she was entombed to be washed or steam cleaned at least once a year. And that's just one of the really specific things that she had in her estate plan. So let's kind of take 3 steps back and say, okay, let's get to her estate plan and talk about what happened, kind of logistically speaking. So I actually found a copy of her last will and testament online, and it's linked in the source links for this episode. And it gives us a pretty good idea exactly what she wanted to have happen. So, for example, that piece that I just shared about the $3 million going to upkeep on her mausoleum, well, through her will, she created what is called a testamentary trust, which is a trust fund that is created in the last will and testament. And it was called the Helmsley Perpetual Care Trust. In that part of the will is where she wanted the mausoleum to basically be kept in perfect shape, in condition, with landscaping and cleaning, etc. And the next section of the will left really specific amounts for people, for her grandchildren, David and Walter, her brother, Alvin, her chauffeur, Nicholas, and she even specifically disinherited 2 grandchildren by the name of Craig and Megan. The amounts varied, and even the method of distribution varied. Some went into trusts for people, others went outright, no strings attached. And Nicholas, just because it's kind of fun that he was included, he got the least amount by far of everyone, and he got $100,000. All others, except for the 2 grandchildren that were disinherited, were set to get millions of dollars. Another interesting tidbit about how things got set up, specifically in regards to David and Walter, which were the 2 grandchildren that were supposed to get an inheritance. David and Walter to receive any distributions from their trust. Leona put in her will and trust that the only way they got their distributions from their trust was they had to visit the gravesite of her deceased son, Jay, once a year. So I guess that would be her dad, right? Their dad. They had to visit the gravesite once a year unless there was some mental or physical disability that prevented them from doing it. And she even included a provision that the trustees of the trust place a register for the people to sign in when visiting. And that way, they would know if David and or Walter were entitled to trust distributions or not. Holy cow, right? And next in the will was a specific and unique gift for her dog, which was a Maltese. The dog's name was Trouble, which I super love. And she left, and I don't even know if you're ready for this, she left $12 million in trust for the care and maintenance of Trouble. And you heard that right, $12 million for the dog. So the way the will is set up is that after all of these, things were addressed, like the grandchildren, the brother, the chauffeur, the dog, after all those were addressed and taken care of financially, then the remaining balance of Leona's estate was supposed to be deposited into the Leona M. and Harry B. Helmsley Charitable Trust, which, according to a New York Times article, was left more than $4 billion. Unfortunately, things really didn't stick, as Leona had documented. Some parties, including the disinherited children, Craig and Megan, contested the estate and trust, claiming that Leona, their grandmother, was mentally unfit when she executed her estate plan. Ultimately, after some time litigating and probably lots of dollars to litigate, all the parties ended up settling, and the distribution went a little something like this. So all the mentioned gifts and amounts to David and Walter, which were the grandchildren not disinherited, Alvin the brother, and Nicholas the chauffeur, they all got their amounts. They were reduced a little bit. But they all got still gifts from Leona's estate. The trust for Trouble, the Maltese, was reduced from $12 million to $2 million. Craig and Megan, so those were the grandchildren that were disinherited in the will, they split $6 million. So probably, I'm going to guess, $3 million each-ish. And finally, the charitable trust, that came with a lot of questions and debate all through the court, because Leona had left very vague and somewhat confusing language for what the trustees were supposed to do. There were amendments done, and they were all kind of conflicting and just really confusing to navigate. So basically, the trust kind of deferred to the judge and said, Judge, what do you want us to do with this? And what ended up happening was that the trustees gave and continue to give to a healthy list of organizations that actually can be found in the source links for this episode. If I listed all of the organizations that benefit from this charitable trust, we would be here all day. All in all, even though her mental state was questioned, her estate beneficiaries, including the ones that she disinherited, but did still end up inheriting, everyone really stayed relatively rational, and things really did not take too long to settle and conclude. And in my eyes, personally speaking, I think much of her intention was generally followed, except for the two that she disinherited. But, from a 50,000 foot overview, they didn't really get all too much comparing what others got, including what the charitable organizations got. So yeah, there's a lot to learn from Leona's plan, a lot to digest for sure. And I hope you enjoyed this one. It was a really fun one for me to dive into for you guys. I just kept thinking, what? She did what? Alrighty, we are ready to wrap this episode up. So next week, we are back to a cautionary tale type of episode where we talk about real life clients, real life cases that I or my office have actually worked on. And during that episode, we're going to go through some super common estate planning misconceptions, and I'm going to tell them through stories. And I'm going to tell them through real life cautionary tales that, whoever they relate to, they may have believed these misconceptions, but then things did not work out so well. So tune in for that next week, Legal Tea listeners. And until then, please take care and please be well.